basis for morality being human life. And when Ayn Rand says life, she doesn't mean just biological life, but flourishing. That's what we sort of,
Correct.
yeah. So I guess because I was questioning, like, part of the confusion was also questioning is why can't you have multiple ultimate goals or values? And we said, well, yeah, you can always have a final goal, and that has sub goals. But then now that when I was thinking about what we're discussing and I was thinking about flourishing, then it does make sense that human life is the ultimate goal because it's the source of everything, right? Like you can't enjoy life, you can't you can't have a flourishing life if you don't have the life, right? So it sort of does make sense to me that that must be the ultimate goal. What else would there be?
More or less. I mean, she talks about the example of the immortal robot in the sense of if there's no life in a complete sense, there's no standard by which to measure something as a value or a non-value. We need a standard of measurement with which to determine. And as a living organism, that's the means we use to judge these things. It is true that without a life, you can't have values. I mean, that's trivially true. But I think it goes a little deeper than that, even to the extent that like life gives meaning to the sense of what you mean value, and being a living organism, you need values to help decide how to live, how to not live. If you were immortal, there would be no alternative towards life or death. There would be no alternative with which to judge even, and you wouldn't even need a code of values. So with life as a standard of value, it's more of like a means in which we can make judgments, because as living organisms, we're just thinking in terms of what contributes to our living and our life and our flourishing.
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit? As living organisms, we're just thinking of...
I mean, as living organisms, there are alternatives because we need to think in terms of what enables our living. We're just thinking in terms of what enables and allows us to flourish. We're just thinking in terms of what life is, rather than strictly a deductive thing like you have life and the only way to value is to be alive. Like, I mean, that's kind of how you want to think of it, but it's important to think it more in a broader sense of taking what you can observe in reality, that you observe ourselves as living organisms, and because you need a code of values in order to live. It's more like a hypothetical imperative in contrast to the categorical imperative. Like hypothetical is like, if you want to live, then you need a code of values, then you need to decide in this manner. In itself, there isn't any, within that claim, it doesn't inherently say that you must value life. Just that if you are to pursue life, you need these values. I would call it a meta-ethical choice when you're deciding whether to live or not. Like, that's the first thing that even comes into consideration. You can't even, there is some debate about that, whether, say, before anything about morality comes into play, you have to make the choice to live, choice for life. It's not just being alive, therefore, obligates you, but you have to, the choice that you make. And you can call that meta-ethical, as in it's the thing that precedes any moral action that we have to decide to value. We have to decide that we want to live, and therefore that choice is what then obligates us to pursue life. Like, it's not, being alive does not in itself require you morally to live. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That does make sense. I understand that. I'm just trying to tie it back to you know how you said I need to think a bit about it in a more, because I said, okay, I was sort of trying to get around, okay, so life is an ultimate value because it's the source of all everything. But you're saying you sort of went into this discussion because um, the way I was thinking about it was too I forget the word you used, but like deductive. Oh, you said deductive. It's not something deductive, but you have to think about it. So I'm trying to make the connection between what you're talking about now and that versus deductive thinking on that issue of ultimate goal and value.
More like deductive in the sense we're not just coming up with a set of claims and therefore deciding what the right thing is. We're thinking of it more in a holistic sense. And that's kind of why I brought in even the meta-ethical thing. Yet holistically speaking, you have to think about even like why are you even trying to decide about what's right or wrong? On some level, you've decided to live. And there doesn't have to be any ethical reason for that. But that's a separate discussion. But insofar as you did choose to live, then there's certain necessities with which to accomplish that. And I mean, I can see that, therefore, that can then lead you to thinking like, well, why can't there be other sinners? And you're right to thinking that like life is the ultimate value because that's kind of where everything leads. It's not everything affects or impacts that, because that's a fundamental choice that needs to be always preserved. That's as living organisms, we're trying to think in terms of our nature. And like when you choose to live, you're choosing to live by your nature, and by choosing to live by your nature, you're just choosing to live and all the things that go with that. I mean, there could be sub goals, of course, as you've identified before. But when we're thinking about it in terms of life, we want to, every choice leads to, in some way, an impact on your life. I think that's the main thing you need to keep in mind. I mean, I know on that thread there was some disagreement about whether every single value can have that impact, but I mean, that's more of an in-depth discussion, I think. But I think the more important point is that because things you do or impact your life, it is a difficult thing to think about, but I guess I would say life is just the most fundamental aspect of everything that you do. I mean, there's other books I've read that can add some context to that. There's Viable Values by Tara Smith, and she really gets into those types of arguments, whether how do we know specifically that life must be the standard value? But I mean, we can talk about and get understanding of it now, but there's always more to learn about it, more nuance we could find out. But I think you're on the right track by saying that. I think you're on the right track, though, that you're thinking about it in the right way, and following that thinking will bring greater clarity over time.
Yeah, and I'm okay, by the way, like we don't need to go, because I understand that there is a lot of nuance to each issue. And it's fine if we go a little bit in that nuanced direction, but then we don't have to go there because it might not be productive, right? At the start, when I'm first going through, say, an essay, it does make like grappling with the more basic issues makes more sense. And then we can always come back and, in future sessions or when we reevaluate what we're doing, we can you work on something in more depth. But yeah, that's fine. You know what I'm getting actually from what you're saying, and you can tell me what you think about this, but I think last session we had, you said, what was the fundamental alternative of life and death, and you were talking about that, and you've mentioned it again now, and now you also, I've never heard of a thing called meta-ethical, but I understand around ethics or outside of ethics, you have to first make the choice to live, and in this morality, that's when morality is relevant because you're choosing to live. The morality is for life. And so I was just thinking, well, in terms of ultimate goal or value, then that you're choosing life. That's the goal you're choosing, and then everything else within that is a sub goal. So by choosing to live, you're choosing that's there's nothing else that can be your ultimate goal or value. You're not speaking about, if you're saying there's some alternative ultimate goal or value, you're then saying you're not talking about life anymore. Does that reasoning make sense?
I think it does. Maybe another way to add some clarity to that is, say you did pick just a less important goal. Let's just say you wanted to be the greatest musician at guitar that in the past 20 years or something. Like, I mean, you could have that as a goal and achieve that, but then, like, to what end is that going towards? Is it, I mean, you could think of that as part of your life, and well, fundamentally, it would, those actions of pursuing that goal would either go towards your life or your death. I mean, that will always be the case in some manner. I mean, you could argue that sometimes it doesn't take you any direction, but we have to think about which direction is it taking us. There isn't like a third direction. There isn't a third alternative of where your existence can go. You either go towards existence or non-existence. Like, as a living organism, you go going towards your death or your life. You can't go. I mean, it's more like that. There is no. It'd be a contradiction of any other alternative. You can go towards existing or not existing. It's more about the existing or not existing, but as living organisms, that would mean being alive or not. I mean, you can't have an alternative. There's no alternative that's between existence and non-existence. There's no semi-existence or half-existence. So you couldn't have an action that leads to like a semi-existence. Either it goes flourishing or slowly to your death.
I think so I had trouble with this previously. I was like, yeah, there are some things I can do that I don't see how that either promotes life or promotes death. But now that I'm thinking about it, and with the discussions we've had, I was going through the essay again, and she says, I'll give you a quote. She says, "The maintenance of life and the pursuit of happiness are not two separate issues. To hold one's life as one's ultimate value and one's own happiness as one's highest purpose are two aspects of the same achievement." And what that means to me when I read that is, when I hear us mention, like playing guitar, whether that's taking you towards life or death, I need to go beyond just biological life, breathing and eating, but is it taking me towards flourishing, or whatever I don't know what the wording for the alternative, non-flourishing. Um, and you could say life or death, because that's the physical aspect of it. But she says they're two aspects of the same thing. So in that case, like, you could say, well, I'm not, if I'm playing guitar on the side and I'm not enjoying it, whatever reason, I don't know why someone would do that, but if I'm not enjoying it, it's taking me away from flourishing. It's not necessarily biologically ruining me. But then it would still fit in with this morality, right? Because it's not, when you say life, you mean flourishing, and they're related, but maybe they're not always the exact same thing. So
yeah, I mean, the important thing about flourishing is just that the idea of overall going towards life, because like everything's healthy, doing well, accomplishing it as best as it can. And if you think about it another way, if you're not flourishing, there's something about you that's going towards death. Of course, you could have a lot of values and a lot of aspects that go different directions. And that's probably why people might even disagree that there are multiple options in any given scenario. But it's more like, yeah, it's important to think about what's your overall condition, not just an individual moment, long range thinking. It really comes down to, well, as we've talked about, the fundamental alternative, life or death. But then how do we know? I mean, you might be getting more into questions. Well, how do we know what the right answer is? How do I figure this out? I mean, it seems like we can't really know whether playing guitar for me would make my life flourishing. All I could go on is it makes me feel good, but that's about it. And somebody might argue that it's because, well, how would we know it? And this is where I guess it comes back to what I was saying, holistic. You have to think conceptually here. You have to think, what are you talking about? You're talking about a human. You're talking about an organism. You have to think about our nature, as in, what are the essential attributes that make us human rather than, say, a tree? How do we know we're a tree rather than a human? I mean, that's a really trivial way to put it, but identifying things like that is really what's going on. It's more like in path of discovery, I guess you would say, that you gradually have to come to understand what brings you to flourishing. I think that's a bit of a tangent, though, because yeah, that's just a little bit of a tangent. I think the more important thing is, I think you're identifying it pretty well, that what life as a center is supposed to be.
What would I found a few working definitions of flourishing, not formally, but just from things people were saying. Do you have one that you use or think about?
The one I think about is more like an apple tree doing well, like I mentioned last time. That just because that's the image I always go to. I imagine a vibrant tree with many apples and comes back, does it well every year. Flourishing, I mean, you could think of somebody in a hospital. They can be hooked up on life support and they're alive, they're functioning, but you wouldn't call them flourishing because you recognize that you're just keeping them alive, rather they're not doing any of those activities that humans do. They're not like regularly eating food, walking around outside, doing something productive, like whatever it might be, whether it's like writing poetry or stacking bricks or something, whatever it might be. Like at a more basic level, flourishing is whether you're functioning as you would expect you should, on average, as you would expect any human to, like alive, thinking, and living and feeling happy sometimes. But if you're in that condition of languishing, I guess is the opposite of flourishing. If you're languishing, you're just really just barely hanging in there, maybe. And you could think of that term, you're not flourishing. I mean, there's a lot of debate you could have whether it's possible to live towards life anymore, but that image in your mind, you could think of somebody in the hospital versus somebody doing like the Ironman competition. Like they're at a completely different state of being. And maybe another way to point out the inductive way of thinking about this is thinking of examples of things. It's kind of an Aristotelian way of doing it. Like Aristotle with his golden mean, he looked at individuals who you could, at like an intuitive level, would say, oh, they're great. What do they do? I'll just do what they do. But it's kind of along those lines. We're just trying to think what makes you identify something as flourishing, as being alive. And we look at certain, maybe what activities they do, how they think about their lives, what attitude they have.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how this is a whole discussion in and of itself, and it could be, you could go way further with it, but we won't go too deep just because, yeah, it's like but maybe at some point later too, because it wasn't that much. She didn't speak about it that much in the essay, I think, because I have other questions I could ask on this, but I'm gonna force myself not to. So, do you know if there are any? This is not to go into it so deeply, but just out of curiosity, is there any discussion around like if I'm thinking in terms of like, okay, should I be a free climber, like climb rocks without a rope, or an accountant? In terms of like evaluating risks of things, because in some way I can imagine some work or some hobbies might be a threat to my biological life, but maybe they do make me flourish. Like, I'm pushing the limits. I'm There's some kind of trade-off happening. Is there a discussion around that? Because that would be pretty, or like eating really delicious food, but that's not that good for you. And you're like, well, am I gonna just like eat Brussels sprouts every day? You know? And there is that, I think maybe sometimes there is that trade-off between biological life and flourishing. And so I'm curious if, either in philosophy or in Ayn Rand's work, is there any discussion on that kind of?
I can't think of an example with in Ayn Rand's work specifically, but I do know Tara Smith in Viable Values, which that's a useful book to have even just as perspective. There is discussion about that for sure. Because that's really just extra added detail after you've read enough Ayn Rand, just to at least have a good handle on her ideas, and then you can get that deep nuance. And that's the best example I can think of. I'm trying to think if there's other cases.
Yeah, I wrote down, you mentioned it earlier as well, so I wrote it down. But it's like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty far away from getting to that right now, as I
Yeah.
still haven't gone through Leonard Peikoff's book. But
Yeah, I can't
cool.
think of any other example at the moment.
Cool. That's a lot anyway. Viable values. I saw that. It's like it would take me a while to get through that, so it's fine.
Mhm.
Okay, so there's this part in the essay where she's talking about morality, and then she's talking about perception, and she's saying higher organisms possess more potent forms of consciousness. This is not a direct quote.
Yes.
They possess the faculty of retaining sensations, which she calls perception. And then she says something like an animal is guided not just by immediate sensations, but by percepts. It can grasp perceptual concretes immediately present and is able to form automatic perceptual associations, but can go no further. In developing a morality like this, because this seems like more of a scientific claim to me. And I'm just saying, like, I'm just kind of curious about, like, do we need, in order to develop a morality like this, for someone to come up with this, do they need this development in science? Like, when we're talking about the origin of emotion, some of these things aren't that obvious to me, just by looking out into the world. Like, I wouldn't look at an animal and go, oh, okay, they automatically integrate their sensations into percepts. So, and this is like very advanced stuff to just look out into the world and observe. So, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between the development of science and a morality of life like this?
Well, I'll answer in two different ways. One, I think from the perspective of Ayn Rand in particular, I think she would say that the scientific developments are valuable, but we can just observe by the way people act that there's more advanced creatures and creatures that don't seem to respond to anything but manage the moment because they don't seem to plan things out. We could argue scientifically exactly where the difference lies, but I think what she's trying to do is say there's just a distinction of behavior that we can observe and that we can see as just as reason as a means of survival, identifying that much. Just observing the use of reason doesn't seem to be present in animals the way we mean it, as in they coming up with language and ideas and things like that. I on the other hand, I'm not from her perspective. I do think you could say that her claims are too strong, considering that they almost sound like scientific claims. How do we know exactly the way they think? And maybe I would change her language as far as a developmental psychology perspective. But if we want to just take it philosophically, the very basic premises of it, I think she's only saying there's differences of complexity in a way. Like you can easily see any difference between an amoeba and ants, a gorilla and a human. And there's some ambiguity, certainly, but insofar as we know we are conceptual. You could argue about other animals, and Rand probably taking a strong stance that animals only have perception. But regardless of whether that's right or wrong, we can identify that we are conceptual creatures. I think that's the more important takeaway point, because I don't think that's really reliant on any particular scientific principle. I mean, as far as Rand is thinking, she does think that there's sensations, and sensations organized in percepts, and with percepts we can create concepts. That's really what her essential claim is. The difficult thing is that even historically, that's always had a very close connection with science. I mean, like Descartes thought that animals were literally just machines. They're just soft machines, but they're machines nonetheless. And right nowadays, we could easily say, well, that's really just a scientific claim, not philosophical, but that's just historically how it is, though. So we can say Rand's position is that animals can only do percepts. But what we can identify still, regardless of that, is not all consciousness is the same. We can recognize that human consciousness is not like a dog consciousness. And we could try to think about what are the difference between a dog consciousness and a human consciousness. You can come with all kinds of theories, for sure. But we're just thinking the difference. Does that clear things up?
Yeah, I guess you could say that she's made an argument to differentiate animals and humans in a way that's more scientifically refined. It's relying on science, but you don't need to. Like, you could make this in a more simple way, like just observe differences between us and animals and say, hey, these guys build these tools and they use these tools to, I don't know, hit rocks and create weapons, and just those more simple observations to then get to the conclusion that, okay, we're different. We need a different, we need something to guide us. And it's not the same things as the same thing that guides animals. So you could probably, she could probably rewrite that without relying on, all these ideas about percepts and sensation.
Yeah, I think she's just offering an added explanation, which, I mean, that's her philosophy, regardless of right or wrong. That's what it is. And you could question that, but I think the important thing is the essential point, which you understand there's a functional difference in our minds, consciousness.
Yeah, I agree. It's not I agree. It was a side point anyway. It wasn't really. I was just sort of curious about it.
I think it's an important one, though, actually. I think to understanding even life as flourishing, like understanding, well, there's a big conceptual issue too. It's not merely being alive. There's so many connected ideas.
Yeah.
Where is your thinking now about like life as a standard value? What other ideas does it bring you to? Does it make you more interested in other aspects of Ayn Rand's philosophy? Like, where does it lead you to, do you think?
Life as the standard of value. So it leads after introducing flourishing, it leads me to think about, well, what is flourishing? What are the requirements for flourishing? How do we know? It leads me to think about, less so having this issue of like biological, but it being an issue of just breathing and eating, and more in psychological issues as well. And it also makes me think of, you mentioned meta ethics, and it's like, okay, it's something that comes up once you choose life. And And to choose life doesn't mean to choose to breathe and eat. Again, it means to choose to flourish. Because, yeah, anyway, but it would definitely more exploring what flourishing means, and then understanding, like, okay, if I choose this thing, but it might shorten my life a little bit, but I enjoy it and it's something that I want to do, exploring those questions too. So it makes me think more in depth about that stuff.
Yeah, you can explore that in a couple ways. You could explore it in terms of epistemology, like how we discover what is flourishing. We could talk about um, characteristics of flourishing, the way we identify them. We could talk about even like the nature of man, how we come to that conclusion, or even concept formation, because you might want to understand more how you form the concept of flourishing rather than understanding it. It really depends on what you feel weakest on.
I'm happy skipping. Like, I will get to it eventually when I go through the OPAR book. But right now I'm happy, like, not going too in, like, going a little bit down the rabbit hole and then just going, okay, right now, no, because there are more essential things to cover. And then you can, I think, because epistemology is something hard. The one thing I don't want to do is I feel like it's too easy for me to get caught up in like some abstract idea and not like I've not really taken it on because I can't explain it. I can't relate it to a million things in my life or whatever. So I'm happy just keep going through random questions about the essay.
Think in terms of that, I think it's more to discuss more about like real life examples of it. I mean, we could discuss all the nuances, but I do think one important part about learning is that you can easily recall this information without feeling overwhelmed. That's usually how I approach it. I have a lot of examples in mind, and I can easily access what I remember that way by having just images to think of. And Rand kind of thinks of literature that way, that like any example in her writing is like that's one of her ideas. Even she's not necessarily trying to present it explicitly, but here are examples of things of the way she thinks. We could think of, well, characters in her books, like who's flourishing or not, because that's part of the way she thinks, so that's part of the way she writes her characters, and they give you examples that call to mind of what her principles are, what she's trying to think of. Flourishing, have you read We the Living?
Yeah, I did, but it was a while ago, so I don't remember that much, but I did read it.
Yeah, we can think in terms of that, even like Kira living in Russia. She wasn't able to attain things she probably could have otherwise if she wasn't so poor or starving and all those other things about Russia. Leaving aside why Russia was that way, we can say she wasn't flourishing. She didn't have the conditions with which to flourish. Like, it could be little things that add up. They could say, yeah, she survived. She was pushing through. She did okay. But was she really flourishing? Was she living up to her potential, her dreams, her desires, her intellect, her values? Could her family achieve things? And we would say no, when she ended up being shot at the end because she was trying to leave and go somewhere better, and she still couldn't. She was killed, and very tragic, of course. And that's maybe a more direct way to think of languishing and not flourishing. That should be an easy thing to call to mind, or we could. But let's get some more personal examples in your life. Has there been any type of choice you made, like with your career, that you regretted doing, or maybe not regretted, but you learned from or realized it wasn't a good choice for you?
Yeah, so I'll give one example, and then another thought I had in terms of flourishing was you could also just think about Peter Keating versus Howard Roark, and Peter Keating at the end when he's trying to paint, that was something he wanted to do, or that was uh, an interest he had which he never pursued, and you can, you know, his psychological state is explained, and you're like, that's not living. He's achieving all these things, but he's not happy. He's not sad. His state is the opposite. And so that's another example of I don't know if it's maybe languishing, or languishing doesn't feel like the right word, but that's another example too on top of Kira. I don't know. It's a hard thing because when I think flourishing versus not flourishing, you know, like, okay, let's say I worked for an extended time in a job I didn't like. So for one point, I worked at a call center. I don't know if you guys have them in the US, but it's like where you're just speaking on the phone all the time to people. And I worked there for 3 years, and I didn't like it at all. Like, but it's hard to recall when I was doing it what was I don't remember fully what my reasoning was for being there, um, and I remember feeling like I didn't have another choice at the time. So weighing all those things together is difficult. Like, when I think of it, I think, okay, that wasn't flourishing. But identifying what exactly it was about the whole experience that wasn't flourishing is difficult. Again, I mean, I don't even have a working definition of flourishing, right? So apart from something that I've noted down, which is living up to your potential, but that's still fairly vague and open-ended.
Yeah.
But I mean, what I'm saying is that I could give you examples, but when I'm thinking of examples of things that come to me, it's more like I didn't feel good doing that. That's the primary over a long time. Like, when I look back at it, I'm like, why did I don't know, that it just didn't feel right. But I can't, it's hard to, I can point to specific things about the work I didn't like, but it's still not clear to me that I chose the opposite of flourishing. Just
that's
like,
true.
Yeah.
It won't be clear sometimes, and that's the difficulty of it. Well, that's the importance of moral principles, because of the amount we don't know. Principles help organize and help us approach different values and ways to think about it. So you're right. I mean, maybe at the time you couldn't really do it very well. Maybe you didn't make the right choice in the end about it, or maybe you did. But at least right now, like thinking back on it, like those are the sort of questions you would want to ask. Like, well, is it worth it having this paycheck? Is it worth it? Do I really need this paycheck? Is there something else I want to pursue? And does somebody who works there make me annoyed? Like, all these questions could become relevant, and like a way to decide is with moral principles, because as a way to organize, well, how do we choose how to attain our flourishing? Moral principles are sort of the function of bringing you towards flourishing, and also in a conceptual sense of narrowing down what to think about, helping you think in terms of essentials, as Rand would put it. Rather than every little detail, we have to think about the broad, most important things about it. I mean, that's part of knowing like what flourishing would be as well. We have to identify what moral principles are, what are the right ways to live, or the wrong ways. We know there are ways, but what are the ways? And we have to start thinking about what different questions to ask, and then go from there. A working definition of flourishing could be that everything's working well as by its nature and as it's supposed to. Like, all is in order in the world, I guess you could think of it as. Like, when things are in order, things are good and things are going as they should. Maybe the best working definition is like living to potential, not just what you can do, but pursuing life in the most varied, well, from all angles. That you're succeeding on all angles, not just one. That could be a better way to put it. Like psychologically, physically, medically, like diet, even, like everything's going towards your life. If that does that help?
Would you say it's a state of action or a state of being, or like, yeah, what?
Probably both. It's the state of being and the state of action, that you can't be flourishing by doing nothing. And flourishing is not just the state we are now, but we have to maintain it. Maintaining it is part of the flourishing. Like, you could take a snapshot right now, say, yeah, you're alive, you're okay, you're not dying. But if we extend it out over time, you can look at how is your overall direction, where's it going? Like, taking all variables into consideration.
I agree with what you were saying before too. I mean, this is part of my interest in why I'm trying to spend more time studying this, like the nonfiction, because yeah, like you can go through a whole day and so many things have happened, and if you can't view it in an abstract way, and you can't make sense of it, you don't know, or you're like another going back to this working a job you don't like. If you can't frame the whole situation in terms of your life, the things that are good for you and bad for you, what'll make you happy or not, which is difficult to do. But if you can't frame it that way, it's impossible to know when you're compromising on something that is essential and when you're not, because everything is just yeah, it's just there's too many things that happen. There's too many conflicting thoughts and feelings. So you definitely need to establish in a bigger picture sense, which I guess you could say is in an abstract sense with principles, what you need in order to live well. Because otherwise it's just too hard to reflect over experiences and extract what's relevant from them and do it really well. So anyway, that's my side thing. But
yeah, I think that's the right way to look at it. I think that's a very coherent way to look at it. And having your ideas easily accessible, your ideas easy to deal with, that enables you to use your reasoning better. It's your means of survival after all. It's not just in a literal sense that you need to figure out how to make an axe. We have to figure out, well, how do we know we even need to make an axe? How do I need to be fulfilled beyond making that axe? Like, reason is, by looking at it that way, we can see reason is informing us in every aspect of our lives. It's, in a way, it's ubiquitous in everything we're thinking about here. And it's more so in that ubiquity is important, that we're always using reason when we're living our life. We're, to some extent, we're always thinking. But that's how we're deciding what these things are. And the reason we frame it in terms of principles and all that would be because you're using reason for everything. So you know the right thing to do once you frame it in terms of concepts and abstractions or long-range thinking. We can even, on an observational level, know what we think about helps us classify things rightly or wrongly, but we still classify things to understand things, come to understand and grasp what to do. Otherwise, we would be overwhelmed if you like, imagine, perceptually speaking, if you just saw a bunch of six on the ground, like, just taking that in, it does, like, it'd be complicated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to see, and maybe the most a beaver can do is make a dam out of it, but what else can they do out of that dam? They're not going to make a home, because they don't have that conceptual ability to hold those ideas, like to work with those ideas on a more abstract level. I mean, it would overwhelm them. I mean, in a sense, they're overwhelmed. Their mind cannot deal with that. I mean, it doesn't affect them because they don't even know what they're lacking. But But another way to think of it is they don't have the means to think of that, and that's why they can't do anything more complex than build a dam. I mean, as amazing as that is, given what they have, it's not what we identify as using reason. That's part of our flourishing because it brings us to from all directions towards our life.
Yeah. I mean, I've got questions because that section, there's a section on reason covered in the essay. It's not, fully comprehensive because it's obviously just an essay, but I've got questions on that too. But I'm aware that it's like 9, or the time there will be different, but it's like 10 minutes left. So I might just stop the recording and we'll just leave it I'll just stop the recording because we covered flourishing and that was pretty good. And so we can just speak ad hoc, random stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.